My name is Thomas Morrison. I'm 48 years old and I've been a funeral director for over 2 decades. Throughout all these years, I thought I'd seen it all. I thought I understood death, mourning, the process of saying goodbye. But there are some things that should never have been witnessed. Some truths I carry alone because no one would believe me if I told them. Do you believe in curses? I didn't. I was skeptical, pragmatic, scientific. To me, death was just a biological process that I helped families navigate with dignity and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. Superstitions were for superstitious people, people who needed fantastical explanations for what was simply natural. That completely changed on a Friday, October 13th, 3 years ago. I'm recording this at 3 a.m. in my home, away from the funeral home. It's the only time I can talk about what happened without my hands shaking uncontrollably. During the day, when I see clients, when I prepare the bodies, when I organize the wakes, I've learned that everything seems normal. I smile, offer condolences, maintain the professional demeanor I learned from my father. But it's not normal. Nothing has been normal since that night. Morrison & Sons Funeral Home is located on a quiet street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's a Victorian building from 1887 with 3 stories and a basement where we do the most delicate work. My grandfather, Benjamin Morrison, bought the place in 1952 for a suspiciously low price. My father inherited it in 1978, and I've been here since 2001, when he died of a sudden heart attack on a Friday the 13th. In 23 years of work, I've organized exactly 2,847 funerals. I remember the number because I keep detailed records of everything. It's a family obsession. Of all those services, only a few occurred on a Friday the 13th. And each one of them was different, wrong, disturbing in a way I can't explain with simple words. If you're listening to me now, it's probably because you've felt something strange too. Maybe you've lost someone on a Friday the 13th. Maybe you've heard whispers in cemeteries. Or maybe, like I once was, you're just curious about what really happens when the lights go out and the living leave. The first time was in April 2007. Margaret Kellaway, 73, died of natural causes on a Thursday the 12th. The funeral was scheduled for the following Friday. I thought it was just a series of strange coincidences, flowers wilting instantly, candles going out with no breeze, temperature dropping for no reason. The second time, in July 2012, I started to suspect a pattern. But it wasn't until the third time, in September 2018, that I understood the terrible truth. They weren't coincidences. I want to tell you in this silent early morning what really happens at a Friday the 13th funeral. Not the silly superstitions you read about online or hear in horror movies. The raw, unfiltered truth, the truth that haunts me every night, that makes me check the locks 3 times before I go to bed, that forces me to sleep with all the lights on. But before I continue, I need you to understand one thing. This is not a story meant to entertain. It's not fiction created to scare. It's my confession. It's my testimony. It's my last resort before I completely lose my sanity. And if you choose to keep listening, know that some images, some truths will never leave your mind. They'll cling to your consciousness like permanent shadows. If you're still here, if you still have the courage to hear what I have to say about those 7 cursed nights, then join me on this journey through my personal hell. But know that after this confession, after you learn the truth about Friday the 13th funerals, you will never look at death the same way again. I will never again be able to ignore the signs that I now recognize instantly. The first time I attended a funeral on a Friday the 13th was in late October 2001, just 3 months after taking over the funeral home. That autumn was particularly cold, and the smell of dry leaves mixed with the characteristic aroma of lilies and wax that always permeates our halls. I was 26 years old and still learning the finer details of the business from Harold, our veteran embalmer. The body was that of Eleanor Ashford, a 67-year-old woman who had died at home, apparently in her sleep. Her daughter, Catherine, came to make the arrangements on a rainy Thursday. I remember her perfectly. Grey hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes red from crying, hands trembling as she handed out the paperwork. She insisted the funeral take place the following Friday, saying it was what her mother would have wanted. It was only when she left that I checked the calendar and realized October 13th, a Friday the 13th. Harold, who had worked with us for over 30 years, frowned when I mentioned the date. "Your father never liked doing funerals on that day," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "He said some dates have a weight of their own." At the time, I thought it was just old superstition, but Harold had a strange, almost worried expression. Preparing Eleanor's body was different. Normally, the embalming process is methodical, almost mechanical. You follow the procedures, maintain the dignity of the deceased, work in silence and respect. But from the moment Harold began the process, small things started to go wrong. The lights in the lab flickered constantly, despite the electrical work done the previous week. The room's temperature remained low, even with the heater running at full blast. Even stranger, Harold mentioned that the body seemed to be resisting the embalming fluid, as if the tissues were rejecting the preservation process. "In 40 years of doing this," Harold said, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold, "I've never seen anything like it. It's like she doesn't want to be preserved." Throughout the night from Thursday to Friday, we heard strange noises coming from the lab, dragging footsteps, as if someone were walking slowly through the halls. Doors opening and closing quietly. The sound system in the main chapel would turn on by itself, playing funeral music at low volume. Every time I went to check, everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched never left me. On the morning of Friday the 13th, when I arrived for the final preparations, I found Harold sitting at his desk, as pale as paper. He was staring at his hands, which were visibly trembling. "Something happened during the night," he said without lifting his eyes. "Something that shouldn't have been possible. When we entered the lab, Eleanor was exactly as she should have been, in the center of the preparation table, covered by a white sheet in perfect preservation. But there was something wrong with the atmosphere. The air was thick with a strange electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. There was a smell, not of decay, but something much worse. A sickly, sweet scent, like rotting flowers mixed with wet earth. "The marks," Harold whispered, pointing to Eleanor's neck. When I lifted the sheet, I saw what he meant. There were purple marks around her neck, as if someone had tried to strangle her. But Eleanor had died in her sleep, of natural causes. There were no signs of violence in the coroner's report. "This wasn't here yesterday," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I prepared this body myself. There were no marks." We took photos of the marks, but when we developed the pictures, they only showed Eleanor's normal neck. The marks were only visible to the naked eye, as if they existed in some dimension that cameras couldn't capture. The funeral proceeded normally, at least on the surface. About 40 people attended, the family cried, and I conducted the ceremony with my usual professional solemnity. But throughout the service, I felt as though there was an additional presence in the chapel. Someone, or something, that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, after everyone had left and the casket was taken to the cemetery, that I found the first clue of what was really happening at our funeral home on Friday the 13th. After Eleanor Ashford's funeral, I spent weeks trying to rationalize what had happened. The marks on her neck, the body's resistance to embalming, the strange noises at night, all of it had to have a logical explanation. Maybe the stress of the job, or perhaps I was projecting my own anxieties onto superstitious dates, but Harold couldn't forget. In the days following the funeral, he became more and more withdrawn, arriving earlier and leaving later, as if trying to avoid being alone with his own thoughts. One morning, 2 weeks later, I found him in the lab, obsessively rearranging the embalming instruments that were already perfectly organized. "Harold," I said, "do you need a few days off?" He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Pure primal fear, as if he had looked directly at something that shouldn't exist. "Tom," he said, using my nickname for the first time in years, "I need to tell you something about this funeral home, about your father, about the Fridays the 13th. That's when Harold told me about the secret records. Apparently my father kept a separate journal documenting all the strange events that happened at the funeral home. Not just the normal funerals, but the anomalies, the inexplicable incidents, the nights when the natural laws didn't apply." "He made me swear I would never tell," Harold said, pulling a small key from his pocket. "But after what happened with Eleanor, you need to know." The journal was locked in a secret drawer in my father's desk. Pages and pages of careful handwriting, dated over 23 years. The first entry was from March 1978, shortly after he inherited the funeral home. The last was from October 2001, 2 weeks before his fatal heart attack. Each entry documented strange occurrences, bodies changing position during the night, whispers in unknown languages, shadows that didn't match any visible light source. But the most disturbing pattern was the entries related to Fridays the 13th. July 13th, 1984. The body of William Hartley began bleeding from the eyes during the wake. When wiped, the blood returned immediately. No family members seemed to notice. May 13th, 1989. During the funeral of Maria Santos, all the candles in the chapel went out simultaneously. When they relit on their own 2 minutes later, there was a sixth candle that hadn't been there before. December 13th, 1996. Found wet footprints on the lab floor, leading from the preparation table to the back door. Small footprints, child-sized. The body was Robert Chen, 45. Page after page of impossible events, all happening on Fridays the 13th. My father had developed his own theory. The dates weren't randomly cursed. There was something specific about our funeral home, our family, that attracted these manifestations. The last entry was the most disturbing. October 13th, 2001. Something is awakening. After 23 years of documenting these events, I'm finally beginning to understand the pattern. It's not the dead who are restless. It's something older, something that uses the dead as vessels. Harold knows more than he admits. If something happens to me, Tom needs to know the truth. Fridays the 13th aren't summoned. They are convocations. My father died 3 days after writing that entry. Harold was watching me as I read, his hands still trembling. "Your father started acting strangely the week before he died," he said. "He stayed late, alone at the funeral home. He said he was preparing for something. The morning he died, I found this on his desk. He handed me a yellowed piece of paper covered with my father's rushed handwriting. It was a list of names, all the deceased who had been attended to on Fridays the 13th, including Eleanor Ashford. Next to each name, my father had written one word: chosen. "Tom," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think your father died of natural causes. I think he was chosen too." It was at that moment that I realized something that made my blood run cold. The next Friday the 13th was just a few days away, and we already had a funeral scheduled for that date. Mrs. Catherine Brennan had called that morning. Her mother had died during the night. The funeral would be on December 13th. The days that followed felt like a countdown to a personal apocalypse. Each day brought me closer to the dreaded Friday, December 13th, and each night I dreamt of voices whispering my name in the shadows of the funeral home. Harold had become my reluctant confidant in this growing obsession, helping me research the building's history and the funerals that had come before. What we discovered in the public records was disturbing. Our funeral home had been built over an old indigent cemetery dating back to 1840. When the city expanded, the bodies were moved to the municipal cemetery, but the records were inconsistent. There were mentions of complications during exhumation and unrecovered bodies. 3 days before the December funeral, I began experiencing things I could no longer rationalize as stress or imagination. Arriving early at the funeral home, I found doors open that I was sure I had locked the night before. Objects were moved. Flowers arranged in the chapel appeared dead by morning. Crucifixes were found turned upside down. Family photographs fell from the walls without explanation. On the night of Thursday, December 12th, everything changed completely. I had decided to spend the night at the funeral home, documenting any unusual activity. I set up a video camera in the main hallway and outside the chapel where Mrs. Dorothy Brennan's casket awaited the next day's funeral. Around midnight, I began to hear sounds coming from the basement. Not the usual creaks of an old building, but something more deliberate. Heavy, dragging footsteps slowly climbing the stairs. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs to investigate. The funeral home's basement had always been a dark place, full of old equipment and empty coffins, but that night, there was something different in the air. A density, as if the very atmosphere had been absorbed. The temperature dropped drastically. I could see my breath forming vapor in the cold air. Then we approached. wet impressions on the concrete floor leading from the storage area to the stairs. Barefoot prints of different sizes, adults, children, the elderly, all wet, as if they had come straight from the damp earth. Following the trail up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it echoing in the silent halls. The footprints led directly to the chapel where Mrs. Brennan was being laid out. When I opened the chapel door, I nearly dropped the flashlight. The casket was open, not just unlocked, completely open, the reinforced lid against the wall. Mrs. Brennan was still inside, but her position had changed. Instead of lying peacefully with her hands crossed over her chest, she was sitting up, eyes closed, but with a strange expression on her face, almost like a smile. I cautiously approached, the flashlight's beam shaking in my frightening grip. That's when I heard something that made me question my own sanity. Mrs. Brennan was whispering, not recognizable words, but a low, constant murmur, like a prayer in a language long dead. When the flashlight illuminated her face fully, her eyes opened. They were no longer the blue eyes I had seen during the body preparation. They were completely black, like wells of absolute emptiness. And when she looked directly at me, her breathing stopped, replaced by a voice that wasn't hers. A multiple voice, as if many people were speaking at once. Thomas Morrison, son of James Morrison, guardian of the door. It's time to fulfill the pact. I stepped back, tripping over flowers scattered across the floor. What pact? I don't know what you're talking about. The thing that had been Mrs. Brennan tilted its head, the smile widening unnaturally. Your family has served for 3 generations. Each Morrison offered their life to keep the door sealed. Your grandfather, your father, now you. It was then that I understood. The sudden heart attacks, the unexplained deaths of the Morrison men, always on Fridays the 13th. They weren't coincidences or selected curses. It was a generational sacrifice, a price paid to keep something contained on the surface. Midnight and 13 minutes, the voice continued. The door opens. You choose, your life to keep the seal, or your soul to serve on the other side. The chapel's clock began to strike midnight. Mrs. Brennan slowly manifested from the casket, her movements stiff and unnatural. Around the chapel, other shadows began to materialize. Figures of all those who had been buried by the Morrison family on Fridays the 13th over the decades. And all of them were staring directly at me. My first instinct was to run. Every survival instinct screamed at me to get out of that chapel, out of the funeral home, out of the entire city. But my legs felt like concrete, and as the shadows solidified around me, I realized leaving wasn't an option. I was surrounded by decades of restless dead, all staring at me with those same black, empty eyes. Mrs. Brennan, or the thing that had taken her body, took a step toward me. Each movement was accompanied by a wet sound, like flesh shifting against broken bones. The smell emanating from her was indescribable, wet earth mixed with something sweet and nauseating, like rotting flowers fermenting in the rain. You still don't understand, the multi-voice said, echoing off the walls of the chapel. Your family is not the guardian of this door by accident. You are the key. Your blood, your lineage is what keeps the seals strong. I finally managed to move my legs, stepping back until my back was against the rear wall of the chapel. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. Stress-induced hallucinations, gas poisoning, anything that made more sense than the impossible reality I was facing. My father never told me any of this, I managed to stammer. If there was a pact, he died without preparing me. The creature's smile widened even further, revealing teeth that didn't belong to Mrs. Brennan. They were long, sharp, stained with a dark substance. James Morrison tried to break the cycle. He thought he could find another way. That's why he died before his time. He was punished for his arrogance. The other shadows closed in, forming a tight circle around me. I recognized some of the faces from my father's records: Eleanor Ashford, William Hartley, Maria Santos, all those who had died on Fridays the 13th over the years. But there were others too, older figures, dressed in clothing from decades past. Each generation of Morrisons has fed this land with sacrifice, the voice continued. Your great-grandfather Benjamin was the first. He made the original pact when he discovered what was buried beneath this foundation. his life in exchange for keeping the ancients asleep. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. What ancients? The clock struck midnight and 10 minutes. 3 minutes remained. The ones who ruled before humans walked the earth. Those who wait patiently beneath rocks and soil, waiting for their turn to return. This funeral home, this city, this entire continent is just a small prison cell held by blood and sacrifice. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the marble, spreading like spider webs from the center of the chapel. A sickly green light began to seep through the fissures, accompanied by a sound that wasn't quite music nor noise, something primordial and terrible that made my bones resonate. Midnight and 11 minutes, a creature announced unnecessarily. 2 minutes, Thomas Morrison, choose your heritage. That's when I remembered my father's final words in his journal. Harold knows more than he admits. Where was Harold? Why hadn't he warned me about this? In fact, where was he on this Friday the 13th, knowing what would happen? Harold! I shouted, my voice echoing through the funeral home. Harold, where are you? To my surprise, I heard footsteps running down the halls. The chapel door slammed open, and Harold entered carrying something in his hands. An ancient cross covered in symbols I had never seen before. Thomas, get out of there now, he called, but the shadows closed in tighter around me, forming an impenetrable barrier. The creature that had once been Mrs. Brennan transformed into Harold, his expression changing to one that could only be described as fury. The faithful servant. You too have a choice to make, old man. I made my choice 40 years ago, Harold said, holding the cross in front of him. When your great-grandfather told me the truth, Thomas. When I became the emergency guardian in case something happened to the Morrison line. Midnight and 12 minutes. The ground cracked completely, revealing an abyss that seemed to descend endlessly. The green light intensified and the hole began to emerge forms that my mind refused to fully comprehend. Tree-sized tentacles, eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence, something vast and ancient moving in the depths. Final minute, the creature's voice multiplied, now coming from all the shadows simultaneously. Your life, freely offered, renews the seal for another generation. Your refusal releases those who sleep and condemns this world. Harold pushed as much as he could against the shadow barrier. Thomas, there's a third option. Your father was right. The cycle can be broken, but not in the way he imagined. Midnight and 13 minutes. The clock struck the fateful hour and everything stopped. In the absolute silence that followed the last chime of the clock, everything in the chapel seemed to freeze in a moment, suspended in time. The shadows stopped moving. The creature that had been Mrs. Brennan stood still like a statue. And even the sickly green light emanating from the abyss in the floor ceased its hypnotic pulsing. Harold seized this cosmic pause to step closer, the ancient cross still faintly glowing in his hands. Thomas, he whispered urgently, there is a third way, but it requires more courage than simply dying. What do you mean? I asked, my voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. The pact doesn't have to be renewed with death, Harold explained quickly, knowing time was running out. It can be transferred, but for that, you need to fully embrace the consciousness of what you're protecting. You need to become more than a guardian. You need to become part of the seal itself. Before I could ask what that meant, time resumed its flow. The creature turned toward us with a roar that shattered the chapel's windows. There is no third option, it said, its multiple voices booming. The pact is clear. Life for the seal or destruction for all. But Harold was right. I feel it now, an understanding that doesn't come from my rational mind, but from something deeper, something older. Knowledge flowed through my Morrison blood, generational memories awakening like a dense river finally reaching the surface. I understood now why my father had tried to break the cycle, why my grandfather had died young, why our family had silently carried this burden for generations. It wasn't just about keeping the ancients contained. It was about willingly accepting the weight of their dreams, absorbing their malevolent influence so it wouldn't taint the outside world. I choose the third option, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. What happened next is hard to describe with human words. I felt as if I were being pulled into myself, descending through layers of consciousness I didn't even know existed. The abyss in the floor of the chapel expanded, but instead of unleashing ancient horrors, it became a portal into my own soul. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor of the chapel. Morning sunlight streamed through the intact windows. Mrs. Brennan was peacefully in her closed coffin, and Harold was sitting in a nearby chair, an expression of rupture and exhaustion on his face. "Did it work?" I asked, slowly rising. Harold nodded, but there was something different in his eyes when I looked at him. "It worked. The seal has been renewed. But Thomas, you're not exactly the same anymore." He was right. I could feel a constant presence at the edge of my consciousness, like ancient voices whispering in dead tongues. They weren't threatening. They were more like a responsibility, a weight I had chosen to bear. The knowledge of the ancients was now with me, but controlled, channeled through my human will. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've conducted these funerals on Fridays the 13th. Each one is an intense experience, a moment when I must use my new nature to maintain the balance between worlds. But there's no more terror, no more surprises. I know what to expect, and more importantly, I know how to deal with it. Morrison and Sons. Funeral home continues to run as usual. The clients haven't noticed anything different, except perhaps that I seem a little more solemn, a little more attentive to the details others might ignore. Harold still works with me, though he's become my mentor on matters far beyond traditional embalming. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the funeral home, I still hear the whispers, but now they're familiar, like conversations with old friends. The ancients sleep, and I am both their prison and their guardian. If you've made it this far to the end of this confession, perhaps it's because you feel there are things between heaven and earth that our philosophy can't dream of. Perhaps you've experienced something that logic can't explain. I want to know, do you believe there are responsibilities that pass from generation to generation, sacrifices some families make to keep the world safe? If this story has touched something in you, if it confirmed the signs I described, comment the word guardian and tell me, would you have the courage to accept a legacy that would change your human nature forever? Because sometimes, at 3 in the morning, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, I wonder how many others like me are out there, carrying similar secrets, keeping silent vigil over mysteries humanity is not yet ready to understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, you are one of them.